The early morning sun barely touched the palace windows when Lyra began her daily routine. Her hands moved quickly across the marble floors, the wet cloth making soft sounds in the empty hallways. She had learned long ago to start her work before anyone else woke up. It was safer that way. Quieter. Less chance of drawing unwanted attention. 3 years had passed since she first walked through these palace doors, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart full of fear. 3 years of keeping her head down, her voice soft and her true nature buried deep inside where no one could find it. The other servants thought she was just naturally quiet, maybe a bit shy. They had no idea what she was really hiding. Every morning, Lyra would drink the bitter tea made from herbs she gathered in secret from the palace gardens. The taste made her stomach turn, but it was necessary. The herbs masked her scent, dulled her natural abilities, and helped her blend in with the regular servants. Without them, her secret would be exposed in minutes. "You're up early again," called out Beth, another servant who worked in the kitchens. Beth was kind enough, always offering Lyra extra bread when the head cook wasn't looking. But even Beth didn't know the truth about what Lyra really was. "Couldn't sleep," Lyra replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. Sleep came hard when you spent every waking moment pretending to be someone else. She had dreams sometimes, strange dreams where she ran free through forests, where her true self could breathe and exist without fear. But morning always came, bringing reality back with the bitter herb tea. The palace had been buzzing for weeks now. King Adrian was finally going to have his coronation ceremony. He had been ruling for 2 years since his father's death, but the formal coronation had been delayed due to wars and political troubles. Now that peace had settled over the kingdom, it was time for the grand celebration that would officially make him king. More importantly, everyone whispered, it was time for him to choose a Luna, a queen. The noble families had been preparing their daughters for months, each one hoping to catch the young king's eye. Lyra had seen them arriving over the past few days, their carriages decorated with family colors, their daughters dressed in silks and jewels that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Lady Victoria seemed to be the favorite. Her father was the most powerful duke in the kingdom, and she was beautiful in that perfect way that came from good breeding and expensive care. She walked through the palace halls like she already wore a crown, her chin high and her smile practiced. The other noble daughters tried to compete, but Victoria had an advantage that went beyond just her father's influence. Lyra watched these women from the corners of rooms, while she polished silver or arranged flowers. They moved with such confidence, such certainty about their place in the world. Sometimes she wondered what that felt like, to walk into a room knowing you belonged there. "Can you believe all this fuss?" asked Tom, one of the stable boys, as he helped Lyra carry fresh linens to the guest rooms. "All these rich folks acting like the world revolves around them." Lyra nodded but didn't say much. Tom was nice, but he was also a gossip. Anything she said would be repeated in the servants' quarters before dinner. She had learned to be careful with her words, just like everything else. The truth was, she understood the fuss better than Tom realized. What the servants saw as just politics and show, Lyra recognized as something much deeper. King Adrian was an alpha, a true alpha with the kind of power that could be felt across rooms. She had sensed it the few times she had been in the same space as him, though she always made sure to keep her distance. And that was exactly why she had to be so careful. True alphas could sense things that others couldn't, especially when it came to omegas. And Lyra wasn't just any omega. She was what her grandmother had called a true omega, born with abilities and instincts that were rare even among her kind. Her grandmother's voice still echoed in her memory, speaking the words that had shaped the last 3 years of her life. "Hide what you are, child, until the right alpha recognizes your worth. The world isn't ready for what you are, but someday, when the time is right, you won't be able to hide anymore. When that day comes, don't run from it. Embrace who you were meant to be." Easy words to say, harder words to live by. Lyra had been hiding for so long that sometimes she wondered if she remembered how to be her true self. The herbs had become such a part of her daily routine that she felt strange without them. The quiet, invisible servant had become like a second skin. But lately something had been changing. Maybe it was all the excitement in the palace, or maybe it was the presence of so many alphas visiting for the coronation. Whatever the reason, her natural instincts had been stirring, becoming harder to suppress. Sometimes she caught herself starting to react to things in ways that would give her away, and she had to fight to maintain her careful mask. The work helped keep her focused. There was always something to clean, something to organize, someone who needed assistance. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, was strict but fair. She had given Lyra a chance when she arrived at the palace 3 years ago, with no references and no family name. As long as Lyra did her work well and caused no trouble, Mrs. Crawford left her alone. "The ballroom needs to be perfect for tomorrow night," Mrs. Crawford announced during the daily staff meeting. "Every surface polished, every candle checked, every flower arrangement exact. The king's coronation happens only once, and it will be remembered for generations. I will not have our work be the thing that goes wrong." Lyra nodded along with the other servants. She had been assigned to work on the mirrors and windows in the ballroom, making sure they sparkled under the hundreds of candles that would light the ceremony. It was detailed work that required patience, exactly the kind of task that suited her need to stay busy and invisible. That afternoon, she stood in the empty ballroom, working her way around the enormous space. The room was beautiful even without all the decorations. High ceilings painted with scenes of the kingdom's history, marble floors that reflected light like water, windows that looked out over gardens that had been carefully maintained for centuries. As she polished each mirror, Lyra caught glimpses of herself. Sometimes she barely recognized the person looking back. The quiet servant with her hair always pulled back, her clothes simple and practical, her eyes kept carefully downcast. Was this really who she was, or just who she had convinced herself she needed to be? "Excuse me," said a voice behind her. Lyra spun around, her heart jumping. She had been so lost in thought that she hadn't heard anyone approach. Standing in the doorway was one of the royal guards, his uniform clean and his expression serious. "Yes, sir?" she said, keeping her voice steady. "The king will be inspecting the ballroom in an hour. Make sure you're finished by then." "Of course, sir, I'll be done soon." The guard nodded and left, but his words sent a new wave of anxiety through Lyra. King Adrian would be here, in this room, while she was still working. She had managed to avoid being in the same space as him for 3 years, always finding excuses to work elsewhere when he was around. But tomorrow was the coronation, and today there was no avoiding him. She worked faster, trying to finish before he arrived. But her hands were shaking now, and she had to stop several times to steady herself. This was exactly what she had been afraid of. The closer she got to powerful alphas, especially one as strong as King Adrian, the harder it became to maintain her control. The herbs she drank every morning created a barrier, but it wasn't perfect. Strong emotions could weaken it, and anxiety was definitely a strong emotion. She could feel her natural scent trying to emerge, could sense her omega instincts responding to the knowledge that a powerful alpha would soon be near. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. "Just finish the job and get out." But even as she said the words, Lyra could feel something changing inside her. The careful control she had maintained for 3 years was starting to crack, like a dam with water pressing against it. Tomorrow's coronation wasn't just going to be King Adrian's moment of truth. She was beginning to suspect it might be hers as well. The afternoon sun slanted through the ballroom windows, creating patterns of light and shadow on the floor she had spent hours perfecting. In a few hours, this room would be filled with the most important people in the kingdom. Kings and queens from neighboring lands, nobles and their families, everyone who mattered in their world. And somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, would be one scared Omega girl pretending to be something she wasn't, hoping desperately that her secret would stay buried for just one more day. But deep in her heart, where the herbs couldn't reach and where her grandmother's words lived, Lyra was starting to suspect that tomorrow would change everything. The question wasn't whether her secret would be revealed. The question was what would happen when it was. She finished polishing the last mirror and gathered her supplies, moving quickly toward the servant's door. But as she reached for the handle, she heard footsteps in the main hallway. Confident, measured footsteps that could only belong to one person. King Adrian was early. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest as she realized she was trapped. She couldn't leave through the main door without potentially encountering him, but the servants' door was across the room. Her only choice was. The coronation morning arrived with gray clouds that threatened rain. But by noon the sun had broken through, casting golden light across the palace grounds. Lyra had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered those footsteps in the ballroom and the way her heart had nearly stopped when King Adrian entered the room. He hadn't seen her, thank goodness. She had remained frozen behind the flower arrangement until he finished his inspection and left. But something about that moment had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. For just a few seconds, when she heard his voice as he spoke to his advisor, every instinct in her body had responded in ways she couldn't control. Now, as she hurried through the servants' corridors with a tray of refreshments, Lyra tried to focus on her tasks for the day. She would be serving drinks and small foods during the ceremony's intermission, staying in the background while the nobles celebrated. It was the kind of work she was good at, invisible service that kept her busy and unnoticed. The palace was alive with activity. Servants rushed everywhere, carrying flowers, adjusting decorations, making final preparations. The smell of food drifted from the kitchens where the cooks had been working since dawn. Musicians practiced in side rooms, their melodies mixing together in a pleasant chaos. "Lyra, take these to the East Wing," called Mrs. Crawford, handing her another tray. "The Duke of Ravenshallow's family needs refreshments in their rooms." Lyra nodded and headed toward the guest quarters. The East Wing housed the most important visitors, the ones whose attendance really mattered for political reasons. As she walked down the decorated hallway, she could hear conversations behind closed doors, voices discussing alliances and strategies and who the king might choose as his Luna. Lady Victoria's name came up in almost every conversation. The beautiful daughter of the most powerful duke was clearly the expected choice. Lyra had seen her that morning, surrounded by servants who were helping her dress for the ceremony. Her gown was the color of deep sapphires, with jewels that caught the light like captured stars. She looked every inch a future queen. The coronation ceremony itself was magnificent. Lyra watched from the servants' area at the back of the great hall as King Adrian took his official oaths. He wore robes of royal blue and gold, and when the crown was placed on his head, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even from her distant position, Lyra could feel the power that radiated from him, the natural authority that marked him as a true alpha leader. The ceremony was formal and ancient, full of ritual words that had been spoken at coronations for hundreds of years. But when Adrian spoke his vows to protect and serve the kingdom, his voice carried genuine conviction. This wasn't just political theater for him. He truly meant to be a good king. After the ceremony came the intermission, when guests could mingle and enjoy refreshments before the evening's celebration ball. This was when Lyra's real work began. She moved through the crowd with her tray, offering drinks and small foods to the nobles who barely glanced at her. To them, she was just part of the scenery, no more noticeable than the furniture, which was exactly how she preferred it. "The wine is excellent," commented an elderly lord to his companion, as Lyra refilled their glasses. "Though I wonder if we'll have cause for greater celebration before the night is over," his friend chuckled. "If you mean what I think you mean, I believe we will. Lady Victoria has been glowing all day. I suspect she knows something we don't." Lyra moved on before she could hear more, but similar conversations were happening all around the room. Everyone seemed to expect an engagement announcement during tonight's ball. The coronation of a king and the choosing of his Luna on the same day would certainly be memorable. She was refilling her tray in the servants' area when disaster struck. "You there, servant girl?" The sharp voice cut through the noise of conversation, and Lyra looked up to see Lady Victoria approaching. The future queen's beautiful face was twisted with irritation, and she was flanked by two other noble daughters who watched with obvious interest. "Yes, my lady," Lyra said, keeping her voice respectfully quiet. "This wine is too warm," Victoria declared, though Lyra was certain the wine had been perfectly chilled when she served it. "And the glass is dirty. Do you people not know how to do your jobs properly?" I apologize, my lady. Let me get you a fresh glass immediately. But as Lyra reached for Lady Victoria's glass, the noble woman suddenly jerked her hand, sending the red wine splashing across the front of Lyra's simple, gray dress. The liquid spread quickly across the fabric, staining it dark. "Oh, how clumsy of you," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby conversations. "Really, you should be more careful." The conversations around them had stopped. Nobles turned to look, their faces showing various degrees of amusement and disdain. Lyra stood frozen, the cold wine soaking through to her skin, knowing that everyone was staring at her. "Look at that," one of Victoria's companions said loudly. "She's making such a mess. Don't they train servants better than this?" "Clearly not," Victoria replied, her voice growing louder and more theatrical. "Perhaps this is what happens when the palace hires people without proper breeding. Some people simply don't know their place in the world." Laughter began to ripple through the crowd. Not kind laughter, but the cruel sort that came from watching someone else's humiliation. Lyra felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I apologize for the accident, my lady," she said again. "If you'll excuse me, I'll go change my dress and clean this up." "Oh, I don't think so," Victoria said, stepping closer. "I think you should clean it up right here, right now, on your knees like a proper servant." The demand sent a shock through Lyra. Around them, the laughter grew louder, and she could hear voices making comments about teaching lessons and knowing one's station. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, but from something much more dangerous: anger. Real, hot anger that burned through her chest like fire. For 3 years she had accepted this kind of treatment, had told herself it was necessary to maintain her disguise. But something about this moment, about being humiliated in front of all these people while they laughed, triggered something deep inside her that she couldn't control. "I said on your knees," Victoria repeated, her voice sharp with authority. "Or perhaps you think you're too good to follow orders." The anger grew stronger, and with it came something else. Something Lyra had been suppressing for 3 years with bitter herbs and careful control. Her natural instincts, her true nature began to rise like water breaking through a cracked dam. "Please," she whispered. But she wasn't sure if she was asking Victoria to stop or asking herself to maintain control. The laughter around them grew meaner, more pointed. She could hear comments about servant blood and proper breeding and teaching respect. The humiliation was complete, public, and deliberately cruel, and it was too much. The careful barriers she had built around her true nature didn't crack. Gradually, they shattered all at once like glass hit with a hammer. The herbs that masked her scent suddenly weren't strong enough to contain what was happening inside her. Her omega nature, suppressed for so long, burst free with 3 years' worth of pent-up power. Her scent bloomed into the room like an invisible explosion. It was unlike anything anyone there had ever experienced. True omega scent was rare enough, but Lyra's was extraordinary even by those standards. It was sweet and wild and powerful, carrying undertones of flowers and rain and something indefinably magical that spoke to the deepest instincts of every alpha in the room. The laughter died. Instantly, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Every person with even a trace of alpha blood turned to look for the source of that incredible scent. The silence was so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat. She saw the moment when Lady Victoria realized what had happened. The noble woman's face went from smug satisfaction to shocked confusion to something that might have been fear. Around them, alphas were beginning to move, their heads turning like hunting dogs catching a scent. "What is that smell?" someone whispered. "Where is it coming from? Is that really—" Panic flooded through Lyra as she realized what she had done. 3 years of careful hiding, destroyed in a moment of anger. She looked around the room and saw dozens of faces staring in her direction, trying to pinpoint the source of the scent that had every alpha instinct screaming. She ran. Without a word, without explanation, she turned and pushed through the crowd, toward the servants' entrance. Behind her, she could hear voices rising, questions being asked, confusion spreading through the room like ripples in water. "Find whoever that was," she heard someone command as she reached the door. Search the servants. That scent. It's impossible. Lyra burst through the door into the servants' corridor and kept running. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst, and she could feel her scent still pouring off her in waves, despite her desperate attempts to regain control. The herbs were useless now. Whatever had broken inside her couldn't be easily fixed. She ran through corridors she knew by heart, past other servants who looked confused and startled. Some of them caught traces of her scent as she passed, and she saw their faces change, saw recognition dawn in their eyes. King Adrian stood in the middle of his coronation celebration, surrounded by hundreds of guests. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. The formal congratulations and political conversations faded into background noise as he focused on something far more important than any treaty or alliance. That scent. He had never experienced anything like it in his life. The moment it had bloomed through the ballroom, every instinct he possessed as an alpha had come alive with recognition. This wasn't just any Omega scent. This was something special, something that called to him on a level deeper than conscious thought. "Your Majesty," said Lord Blackwood, trying to get his attention. "About the trade agreements with the eastern provinces." "Not now," Adrian replied, his voice distracted. He was scanning the crowd, trying to follow the trail of that incredible scent. But whoever had been its source was gone, leaving only the faintest traces behind. Lady Victoria approached, her sapphire gown rustling as she moved. She looked shaken, which was unusual for someone normally so composed. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a curtsy that seemed less confident than usual. "Lady Victoria," he acknowledged, but his attention was still elsewhere. "Excuse me, I need to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned and walked toward the servants' entrance, ignoring the surprised looks and whispered conversations his departure caused. Behind him, he could hear his advisors scrambling to follow, probably wondering if their new king had lost his mind on the day of his coronation. Maybe he had. But Adrian couldn't ignore what had happened. That scent had triggered something primal in him, something that demanded he find its source. As a king, he should probably be concerned about the political implications of walking away from his own celebration. As an alpha, he literally couldn't think about anything else. "Sir," called Captain Hayes, the head of his personal guard. "Where are you going?" "I need to find someone," Adrian replied without stopping. "Find who, sir?" He paused at that question. How could he explain that he was hunting for someone whose face he had never seen, whose name he didn't know, whose very existence had just turned his world upside down? How could he tell his rational, practical guards that he was following his nose through the palace like some kind of wild animal? "I'll know when I find them," he said finally, which was probably the most honest answer he could give. The servants' corridors were a maze that Adrian had never really explored before. As king, his world consisted of grand rooms and formal spaces, not the narrow passages where the real work of running the palace happened. But the scent trail led him here, growing stronger as he moved deeper into the working areas of his own home. He passed confused servants who quickly pressed themselves against the walls and bowed as he walked by. Their faces showed surprise and concern. Kings didn't wander through these parts of the palace, especially not on their coronation day, and certainly not with the intense focus Adrian was displaying. "Your Majesty," ventured one brave serving woman, "is something wrong? Can we help you? Has anyone come through here recently?" he asked. "Someone who seemed upset or in a hurry?" The woman looked confused but nodded. "Yes, sir. Lyra ran through here a few minutes ago. She looked terrified, but we didn't know why. She went toward the storage rooms, I think." Lyra. Finally, a name. To go with the scent that had captured every bit of his attention, Adrian nodded his thanks and continued following the trail, his heart rate increasing as the scent grew stronger. He was getting close. The trail led him to a narrow corridor lined with storage rooms and supply closets. Here, away from the main areas of the palace, the scent was much clearer. It wrapped around him like invisible silk, making his alpha instincts sing with recognition and need. Whatever Lyra was, wherever she had come from, she was meant to be his. Every fiber of his being was certain of that fact. But as he approached the door where the scent was strongest, Adrian forced himself to slow down. Whatever had caused Lyra to run from the celebration, whatever had triggered the release of that incredible scent, she was probably frightened. Bursting in like a conquering alpha would only make things worse. He could hear soft sounds from behind the door. Not crying exactly, but the kind of distressed breathing that came from trying very hard not to cry. His heart clenched at the sound. Whatever had happened in that ballroom, it had clearly upset her badly. Adrian raised his hand to knock, then paused. This was probably the most important moment of his life, and he had no idea what to say. How did you approach someone whose existence you had just discovered, someone whose scent had turned your entire world upside down? He knocked softly. Lyra. The sounds from inside stopped abruptly. He could practically feel her holding her breath. Lyra, it's King Adrian. I'd like to talk to you, please. Go away. Her voice was muffled but clear. Please, Your Majesty, just go away and forget about this. I can't do that, he said honestly. I think you know why. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the celebration continuing elsewhere in the palace. Adrian waited, letting her make the choice. He could probably force the door open if he wanted to, could command her as king to come out. But something told him that approach would destroy whatever chance he had of gaining her trust. I don't know what you want from me, she said finally, her voice small and scared. I want to understand, he replied. I want to know who you are and why. Why I feel like my life just changed completely. Another long pause. Then he heard movement, the sound of someone standing up and moving toward the door. The scent grew, stronger, and Adrian had to grip the doorframe to keep himself steady. This close to her, even with a door between them, his alpha nature was responding in ways that were almost overwhelming. The door opened just a crack, and Adrian got his first real look at the person who had just turned his world upside down. She was beautiful, but not in the way Lady Victoria was beautiful. Where Victoria was polished and perfect, Lyra was natural and real. Her hair had come loose from its servant's bun, and her simple gray dress was stained with wine from whatever incident had occurred in the ballroom. Her eyes were wide with fear and something else he couldn't identify, but it was her scent that nearly brought him to his knees. This close, without the masking herbs she usually used, he could sense everything about her. The power, the purity, the incredible strength that marked her as something extraordinary, even among Omegas. You're him, she whispered, and he realized she was feeling the same overwhelming recognition he was. You're my... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They both knew what she had been about to say. Mate. The word hung in, the air between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Adrian had heard about the mate bond from other alphas, had been told it was rare and powerful when it occurred. But hearing about it and experiencing it were completely different things. Can I come in? He asked gently. We need to talk. Lyra hesitated, then stepped back and opened the door wider. The storage room was small and cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and spare linens. It wasn't exactly a romantic setting for the most important conversation of their lives, but Adrian didn't care. He would have been content to have this conversation in a dungeon if it meant being near her. She pressed herself against the far wall, as if she were trying to put as much distance between them as possible in the tiny space. Her hands were shaking, and Adrian could smell the fear and confusion rolling off her in waves. Please don't be afraid of me, he said softly. I'm not going to hurt you. I know, she whispered. That's not what I'm afraid of. Then what? Lyra looked at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. I'm afraid of what I am. I'm afraid of what this means. I'm afraid that everything I've worked for, everything I've built, is about to fall apart. Adrian wanted to reach for her, wanted to comfort her, but he sensed that moving too fast would only make her more frightened. Tell me, he said instead. Help me understand. So she did. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, Lyra told him about her grandmother's warnings, about 3 years of hiding her true nature, about the herbs and the careful disguise that had let her live safely as an invisible servant. She told him about the humiliation in the ballroom, about losing control of the barriers she had maintained for so long. "I never wanted this," she finished. "I never wanted to be found." "But you were," Adrian said gently. "And now what?" Lyra laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Now you go back to your celebration and you forget this happened and you marry Lady Victoria like everyone expects you to." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and Lyra flinched. Adrian immediately softened his voice. "No, that's not going to happen. You don't understand," she said desperately. "I'm nobody. I'm a servant with no family, no name, no fortune. You're the king. You need to marry someone who can help your kingdom. Someone who can be a proper queen." "The kingdom needs a queen, who is my true mate," Adrian replied firmly. "Everything else is just politics. Politics matter when you're a king. Not as much as this matters." He gestured between them, at the invisible bond that neither of them could deny. "Lyra, I have spent 2 years as king, and before that my whole life preparing to be king. I've made every..." The walk back to the coronation celebration felt like the longest journey of Adrian's life. With every step, the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him heavier. He had found his mate, recognized the other half of his soul, and now he had to somehow convince an entire kingdom that a servant girl was meant to be their queen. Lyra walked beside him, her hand trembling in his. She had changed into a clean dress, borrowed from one of the other servants, and tried to fix her hair, but she still looked like what she was. A working girl suddenly thrust into a situation far beyond anything she had imagined. Her scent, no longer masked by herbs, surrounded them both like an invisible declaration of what they were to each other. "I can't do this," she whispered as they approached the doors to the ballroom. "Look at me. Look at them in there. I don't belong in that world." Adrian stopped and turned to face her fully. "You belong wherever I am," he said firmly. "And I am a king. That makes you exactly where you're supposed to be. But what about?" "No." He cut her off gently but decisively. "No more doubts, no more fear. We do this together or we don't do it at all. But I won't let you run again." Through the ornate doors they could hear the sound of music and laughter. The celebration was in full swing, nobles dancing and dining while they waited for their new king to return and presumably announce his choice of a Luna. Everyone expected Lady Victoria to be crowned before the night was over. Everyone was about to be very surprised. "Your Majesty," Captain Hayes appeared at Adrian's elbow, looking both relieved and concerned. "There you are. The guests have been asking for you. Lord Blackwood wants to discuss the northern treaties, and Lady Victoria's father is eager to speak with you privately." Adrian nodded but didn't release Lyra's hand. "In a moment, Captain. First, I need you to arrange something for me." "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "I need the royal jeweler brought here immediately, and I need a space cleared at the front of the ballroom. I have an announcement to make." The captain's eyes flicked to Lyra, taking in her simple dress and nervous expression. Adrian could see questions forming on his face, but to his credit, Hayes simply nodded. "Right away, Your Majesty." As the captain hurried off to make arrangements, Adrian turned back to Lyra. "The jeweler is bringing a selection of rings," he explained. "I know this isn't the traditional way to do things, but nothing about this situation is traditional." Lyra's eyes went wide. "Rings?" "Engagement rings," he confirmed. "If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. I want everyone to understand exactly what my intentions are." Before she could respond, the ballroom doors opened and several of Adrian's advisors emerged, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and confusion. Lord Chancellor Morrison, a stern man in his 60s, approached with obvious disapproval. "Your Majesty," he said stiffly, "you disappeared from your own coronation celebration. The guests are confused, and frankly, so are we. Lady Victoria is particularly concerned." "I'm sure she is," Adrian replied calmly, "and I'll address everyone's concerns shortly. But first I need to speak with my advisors privately." He led them to a small sitting room off the main corridor. with Lyra still at his side. The advisors filed in, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile, as they took in the young woman holding their king's hand. "Gentlemen," Adrian began, "I'd like you to meet Lyra. She's going to be your queen." The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Morrison's face went through several shades of red before he managed to speak. "Your Majesty, surely you're joking. This is a servant. This is my mate," Adrian corrected firmly, "and therefore your future queen." "But the arrangements with Lady Victoria were never confirmed," Adrian interrupted. "I made no promises, signed no contracts. I am free to choose my own Luna." Lord Chancellor Morrison stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, you cannot possibly be serious. The political ramifications alone would be disastrous. Duke Ravenshollow has already begun making wedding preparations. He's invested enormous resources in the expectation that his daughter would become queen." "Then he made assumptions he shouldn't have made," Adrian replied. Another advisor, Lord Hartwell, joined the argument. "Sir, think about what you're doing. Marriage is not just a personal choice for a king. It's a political alliance, a way to strengthen the kingdom. What does marrying a servant accomplish except to anger our most powerful allies?" Adrian felt Lyra's hand tighten in his, and he knew she was hearing confirmation of all her fears. These men saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their political plans. "What it accomplishes," Adrian said, his voice growing cold, "is ensuring that I have a partner who truly belongs with me, rather than a political arrangement that serves everyone except the two people actually getting married." "But Your Majesty," pressed Lord Morrison, "the people expect certain things from their royal family. Bloodlines matter. Breeding matters. What will they think when they discover their queen was a servant?" "They'll think their king chose love over politics," Adrian replied. "And maybe they'll respect him more for it." Lord Hartwell shook his head frantically. "This could mean civil war. Duke Ravenshollow won't take this kind of insult lightly. His military forces are considerable, and he has allies among the other noble families. If you reject his daughter for a servant, he may consider it an act of aggression." Adrian had expected this argument, and he had already considered his answer. If Duke Ravenshollow chooses war because his daughter isn't queen, then he was never truly loyal to the crown in the first place. Better to find that out now than later. "You're being naive," Lord Morrison said bluntly. "Love is a luxury that common people can afford. Kings must think of duty, of responsibility, of the greater good. And what good is a kingdom if it's built on lies?" Adrian shot back. "What good is a crown if wearing it means denying the most fundamental truth of who I am?" The arguments continued for another 10 minutes, growing more heated with each exchange. The advisors presented every practical objection they could think of, like political alliances, economic considerations, military concerns, public opinion, and to each one Adrian had the same basic response: some things mattered more than politics. Finally, Lord Morrison played what he clearly thought was his strongest card. "Your Majesty, even if we set aside all other considerations, you've known this girl for less than an hour. How can you possibly be certain that she's suitable to be queen? What do you really know about her background, her character, her abilities?" It was Lyra who answered, her voice quiet but clear. "He knows that I've worked in this palace for 3 years without a single complaint against me. He knows that I've earned the respect of the other servants through honest work and fair treatment. He knows that I've never taken anything that wasn't mine, never lied to gain advantage, never used my position to harm others." She paused, looking directly at Lord Morrison. "And he knows that when I could have revealed my true nature to gain power or influence, I chose instead to hide it and work as a servant, because I believed it was safer for everyone. If that doesn't speak to character, I don't know what does." The advisors looked surprised by her response. They had clearly expected either silence or defensiveness, not this quiet dignity. Adrian felt a surge of pride as he watched Lyra stand up for herself. "Furthermore," she continued, "the king knows that I didn't seek this situation. I didn't pursue him, didn't try to catch his attention, didn't scheme or manipulate to gain his favor. The mate bond chose us for each other, not the other way around. If you have objections to that, take them up with fate. Lord Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss, what is your family name? I don't have one, Lyra replied simply. My grandmother was my only family and she died 3 years ago. She was a healer who served common people in small villages. No title, no wealth, no political connections. Just a good woman who taught me to value honesty and hard work. No family name, Lord Morrison repeated, as if this confirmed all his worst fears. No noble blood, no political value, no dowry or connections. Your Majesty, surely you can see that this is impossible. What I see, Adrian said firmly, is a woman with more natural dignity than half the nobles in that ballroom. What I see is someone who has spent 3 years proving her worth through actions rather than demanding recognition based on birth. What I see is my mate, chosen by forces beyond any of our control. He stood up, indicating that the discussion was over. Gentlemen, I understand your concerns and I appreciate your loyalty to the kingdom. But my decision is made. I will announce my engagement to Lyra tonight and she will be my queen. You can choose to support that decision, or you can choose to find new positions elsewhere. The threat was clear, and the advisors exchanged worried glances. Finally, Lord Morrison nodded stiffly. As you wish, Your Majesty. But I hope you're prepared for the consequences. I am, Adrian replied. And more importantly, we are. As the advisors filed out, muttering among themselves, Lyra turned to Adrian with wide eyes. Did you really just threaten to fire all your advisors for me? I threatened to fire them if they couldn't accept my choices, he corrected. There's a difference. Is there? She looked troubled. Adrian, maybe they're right, maybe this is. The ballroom fell silent as King Adrian walked through the doors with Lyra at his side. Every conversation stopped, every dance paused, every glass of wine remained halfway to waiting lips. The sight of their newly crowned king holding hands with a servant girl was so unexpected that for a moment, no one seemed capable of processing what they were seeing. Lady Victoria stood near the center of the room in her magnificent sapphire gown, surrounded by well-wishers who had been congratulating her on her presumed upcoming engagement. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked very much like fury. Your Majesty, called Duke Ravenshollow, Victoria's father, his voice carrying across the silent room. There you are. We've been waiting to continue the celebration. Adrian nodded politely but didn't release Lyra's hand. Instead, he walked with her to the raised platform at the front of the ballroom where his throne sat. The crowd parted before them like water. Nobles, stepping aside while staring openly at the unexpected pair. Captain Hayes, Adrian called. Please ask the musicians to stop playing. I have an announcement to make. The music ceased immediately, leaving the ballroom in complete silence except for the rustle of silk gowns and the soft murmur of confused whispers. Adrian looked out at the sea of faces, nobles from his own kingdom and visiting dignitaries from neighboring lands, all of them waiting to hear what their king had to say. Beside him, Lyra was fighting not to tremble. Her simple, borrowed dress looked painfully out of place among all the silks and jewels, and Adrian could sense her overwhelming desire to run and hide. But she stayed beside him, drawing strength from their joined hands and the mate bond that connected them. My lords and ladies, Adrian began, his voice carrying clearly through the large room. Thank you for being here to celebrate my coronation. Your presence honors both me and the kingdom. Polite applause rippled through the crowd, but Adrian could see the tension and curiosity on every face. They all knew something unusual was happening. Today marks not just my official crowning as your king, but also a new chapter in my life and in the life of our kingdom. As you know, it is customary for a newly crowned king to choose his Luna, the woman who will stand beside him as queen. Now the whispers grew louder. Lady Victoria stepped forward slightly, her chin raised with confidence. Around her, the other, noble daughters who had hoped to catch the king's eye looked disappointed but resigned. Everyone in the room assumed they knew what was coming next. I have indeed made my choice, Adrian continued, but it may not be the choice you were expecting. The Whispers stopped abruptly. Every eye in the room focused on the king with laser intensity. Adrian turned slightly toward Lyra, and the movement made their joined hands visible to everyone in the ballroom. A collective gasp went up from the crowd as they began to understand that something unprecedented was about to happen. 3 years ago, Adrian said, his voice growing stronger, a young woman came to work in our palace. She asked for nothing but the chance to earn her keep through honest labor. She has served faithfully, kindly, and with a dedication that has impressed everyone who has worked alongside her. Duke Ravenshallow's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. Your Majesty, he interrupted, surely you're not suggesting— I am not suggesting anything, Adrian replied firmly. I am announcing that I have found my mate, my true partner, the woman who will be my queen. The explosion of sound that followed was unlike anything the ballroom had ever heard. Gasps, shouts of protest, exclamations of disbelief all blended together into a chaos of noise that seemed to shake the very walls. Through it all, Adrian stood calmly, still holding Lyra's hand, waiting for the initial shock to pass. This is outrageous, Duke Ravenshallow shouted over the noise. Your Majesty, you cannot possibly be serious. A servant? A girl with no name, no family, no breeding? This is an insult to every noble family in the kingdom. The only insult here, Adrian replied, his voice cutting through the Duke's protests, would be if I denied the mate bond that fate has given me in favor of a political arrangement that serves everyone except the 2 people who would have to live it. Lady Victoria pushed through the crowd, her beautiful face twisted with anger and humiliation. Father is right, she declared, her voice shaking. This is madness. How can you choose some common servant over me? Over us? She gestured broadly at the other noble daughters. We are your equals, your proper matches. She is nothing. She is everything, Adrian replied, and the simple certainty in his voice silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have. She is my mate, chosen by forces beyond any of our control, and she will be my queen. But the political implications, began Lord Blackwood, will be what they are, Adrian finished. I am not the first king to marry for love rather than politics, and I won't be the last. The kingdom will survive. Will it? Duke Ravenshallow demanded. When the other noble families see how you treat those who have served you faithfully, when they realize that years of loyalty and support mean nothing compared to the whims of a servant girl? The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Adrian felt Lyra's hand tighten in his. She was hearing all her worst fears voiced by the most powerful man in the kingdom, confirmation that her presence would cause the exact problems she had worried about. But before Adrian could respond, someone else spoke up. That's not true. The voice came from the crowd, and everyone turned to see who had dared to contradict the Duke. It was Beth, the kitchen servant who had been kind to Lyra over the years. She stepped forward hesitantly, clearly terrified but determined to speak. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, she said, her voice shaking but clear. But that's not true. Lyra never asked for any of this. She never tried to catch the king's attention or get above her station. She just worked hard and treated everyone fairly. You forget yourself, girl, Duke Ravenshallow snapped. This is not a conversation for servants. Maybe it should be, said another voice. This time it was Tom from the stables, who had stepped forward to stand beside Beth. Maybe the people who actually know Lyra should have a say in whether she's fit to be queen. More servants began to step forward, emerging from the edges of the room where they had been invisible, serving drinks and maintaining order. Mrs. Crawford, the head housekeeper, James from the gardens, Mary, who worked in the laundry. One by one, they moved toward the front of the ballroom. What is this? Lady Victoria demanded. Father, make them stop. But Duke Ravenshallow looked as confused as everyone else. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. Servants didn't speak up at noble gatherings. They certainly didn't defend each other against the criticism of dukes. Mrs. Crawford, as the senior servant present, became their unofficial spokesperson. Your Majesty, she said, offering a respectful curtsy, if I may speak? Adrian nodded, curious to hear what she had to say. "I've worked in this palace for 30 years, Mrs. Crawford began, and I've seen servants come and go. Most of them do their work and keep to themselves, which is as it should be. But Lyra has been different from the start." She turned to face the crowd of nobles, most of whom had never really looked at her before, despite the fact that she had been managing their comfort for decades. When young Mary's mother died, Lyra sat with her through the night, comforting her and helping her write the letter to her family. When James hurt his back and couldn't do his gardening duties, Lyra took on extra work to cover for him until he was better. When we had those sick children in the servants' quarters last winter, Lyra helped nurse them back to health, risking her own wellness to care for others. Mrs. Crawford's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "She's never asked for special treatment, never put on airs, never acted like she was better than the rest of us, but she's been a leader among us all the same, the person we turned to when we needed help or guidance. If that's not the kind of person who should be a queen, I don't know what is." A murmur of agreement went through the servants, and Adrian could see that their words were having an effect on some of the nobles as well. These were people who had observed Lyra's character day after day, year after year, in ways that the political classes never could. "Furthermore," Mrs. Crawford continued, "begging your pardons, but I've watched most of you noble ladies over the years too. I've seen the tantrums, the cruelty to servants, the treating of people as less than human because they weren't born with titles." Her eyes flicked briefly to Lady Victoria. "If character matters for a queen, then Lyra has more of it than most." The ballroom erupted in chaos again, with nobles shouting protests and servants nodding agreement. In the middle of it all, Adrian felt Lyra pull on his hand. He looked down to see her staring at him with wonder. "They're defending me," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Of course they are," he replied. "They know who you really are." Duke Ravenshollow was not finished fighting. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "but pretty speeches from servants don't change the fundamental facts. This girl has no noble blood, no political value, no resources to bring to a royal marriage. What does this union accomplish except to weaken the crown?